Hello, BookTube. I have a guest with me today, best-selling author Wendy Holden, the author of The Royal Governess. The UK title, she tells me, is just The Governess, and it is lodging on the bestseller list there. And it is a historical novel about the woman who was the governess for the two royal princesses during World War II, one of whom is the current Queen of England, Princess Elizabeth, and her sister, Princess Margaret Rose. And I thought we would have a chat about the House of Windsor and all things related to this novel. So welcome, Wendy, to the show.
Thank you for having me, Steve. It's fantastic to be here.
Now, my viewers are bored to their eye teeth with me droning on and on about historical subjects, so I thought I'd let you do the droning.
Yeah, I can drone.
Could you tell them, your novel is about a young woman named Marion Crawford. Could you tell them where she fits in history? Who is she? What is this story?
Well, that's a really good question, because that's the question everybody would ask me. It's a question I asked them when I discovered her memoir, which is called The Little Princesses, and which I based The Royal Governess on. I mean, the thing about the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth, is that she's the most successful monarch probably ever. She's certainly the longest lived, and she's one of the most successful public figures in the world. And yet the person who influenced her, the person who taught her and had a crucial influence on her as a child, is completely unknown. And this woman, as you say, is Marion Crawford. Marion Crawford, when she first entered the world of the royal family, was a young trainee teacher. She was a student, basically. She was in her early 20s. She was one of a generation of women who just got the vote, who could train for a profession. So she was a really forward-looking person. She was a modern person, a modern woman. And she didn't want to work for royalty. Her ambition, her vocation, as she saw it, was to work with the poor children in the slums of Edinburgh. She wanted to close the gap between the haves and the have-nots. So she was a really progressive figure. So when I came across that, which was pretty much on the first page of her autobiography, I just thought, how did a woman like that, a young girl with progressive ideas, end up working for the House of Windsor? So that was what started me off. And I could go, do you want me to explain how it happened, Steve?
Well, sure.
Would you like me to say how that all began? Yeah, because okay.
All of this is known to history, so you're not spoiling your book. But I also want to make sure we include.
Not at all. No. Yeah.
But go ahead. Yes. How did the job happen?
Yeah.
Because it is an odd juxtaposition, isn't it? She's effectively the last person.
It's a really strange story. Exactly. She's the last person on earth who wanted to work for the royal family, and she was the person that they really, really wanted, because they could see that it was an unexpected meeting. She was working for the Duchess of York's sister. The Duchess of York was the mother of the little princesses. She became Queen Elizabeth, wife of George VI, so the Queen Mother, effectively. But at the time, she was called the Duchess of York. And she was visiting her sister, who lived in Edinburgh. And her sister had taken Marion Crawford on for the summer to look after her daughter. So the Duchess of York, so this young, jolly, interesting young woman running around the lawns with her little niece, and just thought, that's what we want. That's what we need for Elizabeth and Margaret. So she persuaded Marion to come down south, to come down to join the royal family. Marion was incredibly reluctant, didn't want to do it, and this was one of the things that was most fun about the book, was sort of imagining and fictionalizing these situations. So one of my favorite scenes in The Royal Governess is when they first meet, which is when Crawford, as they called Marion Crawford, the little princesses, she spent the whole day on the train from Edinburgh. She's completely exhausted. She's arrived at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, really, really tired, wants to bed, doesn't want to be there anyway. Met at the door by this imposing butler, this very sort of formal butler, who, instead of saying you can go to bed, said, oh, the princess has insisted on waiting up for you. You've got to come and see her. And that was just no, I don't want to do that. She'll be an awful brat. And going into the royal night nursery, Marion Crawford saw this little girl sitting up in bed with curly blonde hair, all sort of, sweet looking. She had 2 dressing gown cords tied to each corner of the bedposts, and she was jiggling them, and she was pretending to drive her horses around the park. It's so unexpected, because she'd been, imagining some hideous spoilt brat completely surrounded by presents or in some kind of huge 4 poster, goodness knows what. But to see this sort of very endearing child was the last thing she expected. And it was the beginning of this relationship between the 2 of them. And I think if it hadn't been for the fact that the 2 of them hit it off so well, she probably would have gone back after a few weeks. But as it was, she stayed for 17 years. So that's how that began. And yeah.
Now, as you put it in the book, you never really leave the palace. but
no, well, that exactly, yeah.
But that's the irony, isn't it, of Crawford's story, is that the palace can leave you.
Yeah.
And
yes, exactly.
Again, I'm assuming we're not spoiling the book to say where her
that's no. I mean, for me, what the reason The Governess had to be written was that there were 3 distinct parts of the story. It's a bit like a film, or it's a bit like it's just got those 3 distinct, really dramatic elements. So the first is the contrast and the unlikely. The whole idea of this woman with her woke ideas, this young student ending up working for the royal family, that was so unexpected, such a contrast. Everything about that was the last thing either of them expected. And then when she got to the palace, when she got to the royal family, she didn't leave all her progressive ideas behind her, which was also completely irresistible for me as a writer. She brought them all with her. And so she thought the little girls, Elizabeth and Margaret, just didn't see enough normal life. They had no idea how ordinary people lived. And she felt that was not only not a good idea as human beings, but in the context of them being members of the royal family. If they're too far removed from how ordinary people live, I mean, what's the point of them? How can they relate to anybody? What happens in the future? So she took them out into the real world, and she took them down the tube, down to the subway, the London Underground. She took them to Woolworths shopping, and she took them swimming at public baths. So she did a lot, and she also set up a girl guide pack at Buckingham Palace. So she tried really hard to try and bring in as much normal life to the palace as possible. So that was all amazing and fascinating, and I didn't know any of that. I'd never heard it before. But then it turned out, and it's such a gift for me as a novelist, it turned out that the 17 years that Crawford spent working for the Windsors just happened to be the 17 most sort of seismically, convulsively interesting years in probably in the royal family's history, or at least recent history, because we begin with the abdication. She was with them through the amazing story of the abdication, the completely unexpected, out of the blue, dramatic events of Edward VIII renouncing the throne. And then the coronation of the princess's own parents, which was completely not supposed to happen. I mean, who could see that coming? So that happened next. And then, as if all that wasn't enough, the whole of World War II. So she was with them through all these huge historical events, and so writing the Royal Governess was just so brilliant, because it was just a new angle on these stories, which are quite well known. I mean, obviously the abdication, coronation, and particularly the war are very well known stories, but I had a completely different and unique point of view, which was not just from inside the palace, because Crawford saw all these events just as the Windsors did, but from the point of view of the 2 little girls who were right at the centre of it and didn't actually know what was going on quite a lot of the time. So it was just an amazing, completely new angle that it was just a complete, absolute thrill to discover. So that was the second. And then, as you say, the final part, which is again a contrast to the previous 2 parts, is when Crawford leaves the royal family. She left the royal service in 1949. And she made a bad marriage to a quite manipulative man who helped persuade her to write this book, The Little Princesses, which is the one I found in the first place, which resulted in this lifelong ostracism the royal family were completely furious. They regarded it as the most heinous betrayal, and they cast her into the outer darkness. And this is, life for them, essentially. So it was pretty unfair, but I think they wanted to make an example of her. And I think they wanted to discourage anyone in the future from writing a book about the royal family, which obviously went really well, Steve, didn't it? Because, no one's written a word about it since. So it was the
scene of the book.
It was really,
moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So she, yeah.
She's still hoping that they will soften their stance, even at the end of the book, at the end of her life.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So having been cast into the outer darkness, she went to live in Scotland. She went to live in Aberdeen, and she bought a house right by the road to Balmoral. And so this meant that every summer, the royal cavalcade or motorcade rather, of gleaming limos going from probably from the airport or from the station to Balmoral, to the castle she would have known so well and went to so many times, went right past her door. And so she was hoping that they would stop one day, that they would come and see her, that they would forgive her, but they never did. And it was nearly 40 years after the publication of her her memoir, that she died. So it was nearly 40 years of this situation continuing. So those are the three really dramatic, different separate parts, all of which made an amazing story, and which no one has ever heard.
You had to have come to that memoir of hers in the way that everybody else does, in an atmosphere that the author is a villain.
Yes, well, that was what was interesting.
But you researched it, right? You had to find you found him obviously a very different person, not a villain at all.
Not at all, no. And I couldn't see, well, I mean, having read it, because I don't think many people bother to sort of look at these things properly. And when I picked it up, I found it in a secondhand bookshop. And as I say, I sort of vaguely knew her name, but I didn't know the whole story. But it was that very first page on which she says, I never intended to work for royalty. I wanted to work in the slums of Edinburgh. I just thought, this is a story. This is amazing, because this is just a sort of, posh girl who wants to go and work for royalty. This is someone with a completely different set of values, coming from a completely different background. And that contrast was just fascinating. And that was what drew me in.
I'm wondering if your reaction to The Little Princesses the first time you read it was similar to my own. I came to it knowing the story, but when I first read the book, my first reaction was, this is completely innocent.
Exactly. Well, it was completely innocent, and it's more than that. It's sort of positively loving, so compared to more recent.
So why do you think the royal reaction was the way it was?
I think it was because, I think they just wanted to make sure nobody else would do the same thing. I think at that time, people in royal service, it worked on a code of silence. You were expected to say absolutely nothing.
Absolutely.
And so I think they just wanted to make sure that no one else would have the same idea.
A glowing account would be frowned on. Silence.
Well, it seems. I think so. I think they just, it hadn't really been done before, so it was the first of its kind. And even though, as you say, it's completely loving and it makes the royal family, George VI family, the king, the queen, and the two girls, Elizabeth and Margaret, they just seem like the kind of perfect family. Everything is so lovely. It's so different from subsequent accounts of the Windsors and their infighting and their jealousies and all the rest of it. This is just a wonderful family. You sort of wish you were one of them,
Yes.
So exactly. So it was so unfair that she was treated the way she was. But of course, times were different then. But I think by any standard, it was harsh. And the fact that they never melted, they never altered their stance towards her for all those years. And when she died, they didn't send any flowers. There wasn't a single royal flower. And you have to remember that Crawford she was a young girl when she joined the royal family. She was in her early 20s. But by the time she left, having made several attempts to leave and get married and have a family, all of which were rebuffed by her employers, they wanted to keep her. It was too late. She couldn't have children. Her attempts at relationships had all, petered out. So she had nothing, there was nothing left. And that's what's so unfair. You know, this isn't someone who worked for a couple of years. It was someone who gave up her everything for them. And she steered them through these really difficult situations. So, for example, it was when George VI became king, it was Crawford who had to tell his daughters. It wasn't the Queen Mother, it wasn't the king himself, it was her. She literally had to take them into the room and say, well, girls, you know, Daddy's a king now, and this is going to mean this, that, and the other, which is just an amazing. So she was there, right in the red hot center of history, and she steered that. So during the Second World War, they were all locked down in Windsor Castle, and when the bombers came over, they all had to run down to the medieval dungeons, which were the air raid shelters. And so it was her that took them down there. It was her that sat with them, you know, while the Luftwaffe, you know, went overhead. And she was there looking after them during all these really difficult and frightening times. And yet, you know, all that was forgotten afterwards. But I must say, in the Royal Governess, I really wanted to concentrate on the sort of amazing dramas of it, and at the heart of it isn't really the tragedy at the end, although that's obviously an important part of the story. At the heart of it is this relationship between this really odd couple, this young sort of woke teacher, and this very formal, very eager to please, very old-fashioned child that Princess Elizabeth was. It's the most incredibly odd combination, and yet they hit it off, and and she had such a huge influence on her, because I think all that, taking the Queen out in the world, showing her how ordinary people lived, has helped make her the monarch that we know now. This woman who, even though nobody really knows her at all, everybody thinks she has the common touch, everybody thinks that that people sort of, they think they have something in common with her. They can relate to her. They feel for her during all her problems, for example. So she has this air about her of reassuring sort of ordinariness, which is completely related to those early experiences with Crawford, taking her out and showing her the normal world. So I think she's had a massive impact. So she's a really important historical figure. But as I say, because of all those years of cutting her off and effectively whitewashing her out of the royal story, she's been completely buried. But that, for me, was a great opportunity.
But you mentioned,
because I've always, sorry.
You mentioned that the second item of interest for this thing to attract a novelist was the seismic nature of the events of the history that was covered by
Yes. Yeah.
Was that ever a challenge, to make sure that those events didn't out your main character right off the stage?
Definitely. Well, definitely, that absolutely, because there were I had to do a lot of editing, picking out and I tried to do it through the personalities. So, for instance, one of the great, really interesting things to do with the book, with the Royal Governess, was the Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth, who became the Queen Mother, starts the story as a Duchess of York, as a young, quite sort of a bit spoiled, a bit trivial, not a very serious character, and quite spoiled, you know, quite entitled. But when she became the Queen and the war came along, I wanted to show how she really stepped into the role and changed from one kind of privileged person to be this really inspiring, sort of noble figure, sort of rallying the nation. And it was such a huge change. And that was a really exciting thing to write. But also, because of the international nature of the war and all the different personalities coming, I had a lot of fun with the American characters. And so, of course, I had Mrs. Roosevelt makes a star appearance, and the Kennedys, and General Eisenhower. So that was great. And of course, before we even get to the war, I have Wallace Simpson, who I'm completely fascinated by. So, you know, there was lots of brilliant characters. So I tried to approach the war through the characters, really. But obviously, getting the events, which were very fast moving, as you know, getting all those right was a challenge. But it was really interesting. I loved it. I learned so much, and it was fascinating.
I'm wondering, One thing I noticed in the book that impressed me a lot was that you, despite knowing the story's ending, I mean, there's no way to describe the Windsors' treatment of her as anything other than awful after she left there, after the book.
Yeah.
And yet, you resist the temptation in this book to read that back and make them odious in the 40s. Instead, it's just this bubbling of characters who have flaws, but you don't weight the scales to say, oh, sure, they're nice now, but wait till you see what they're going to be like. Well, I thought the development of Queen Elizabeth was one of the best parts of the book.
Yeah.
That shift from...
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah,
well, you have her
thank
herself.
you for that, Steve.
Describe herself as a Woodhouse character. As a P.G. Woodhouse.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the line you have her
I think
she's not that bright, where she's the one to say that.
Yeah.
But then you develop her into a far more substantial figure.
Yeah. Thank you. I really wanted to do that because I think that's exactly what happened. I think she was a bit of a Woodhouse character. And I think she became this noble figure, this inspirational figure. And in fact, she was so successful, and she was a genius at PR. I mean, you know, the more I read about her during the war, the more impressed I was. So, for example, you know, you never saw the Queen Mother in a uniform. Queen Elizabeth wore a uniform, but George VI was never out of one.
Right.
And so between them, you know, he was the fighting front. She was the home front, and it was just brilliant. And I think they just kind of came up with those things themselves. They were so effective, and he was all shy and stammering before the war, and then he kind of stepped up and became this inspirational figure too. So I really wanted to have that, you know, because part of what I was trying to do with the book generally was to show, and this is what Crawford was trying to tackle when she first joined the royal family. The country and the royal family were on a completely different tracks, you know, because in Britain in the 1930s was a complete sort of powder. And if the powder cake, people were very angry, people were very poor, people were unemployed. It was really convulsive. You know, lots of ideas of communism and republicanism. It was not a great time to be royal. And throwing into that the abdication, which was so unpopular, they were at a really low ebb. And it was, you know, not a good time to be living this kind of royal privileged, detached sort of way of going on. But once the war came along, and the family had a role, suddenly everybody was in the same direction, you know, against a mutual enemy. And it was such a dramatic switch.
Right.
And in a sense, you know, the Windsors have worked. That's been, you know, they've sort of banked on that ever since, and that's what's really carried them through ever since. And that's partly why it's so important the Queen stays there, because that's, you know, that connects back and gives them their authority.
Well,
but it's that was a
palace, right? Once the royals were
gone,
that once the Queen was able to
yes, exactly,
mind about being able to look at the end of the place, that changed everything.
Exactly,
exactly. All in the war
absolutely.
But
exactly. So
I'm wondering, another element that's all throughout the book is your version of little girl Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth, is extremely formidable, even from a very young age. Total self-possession, total awareness of what's going on around her. Would that obviously had to be intentional on your part to create that figure?
Yes. Yeah. But I think I think it was quite true to life. I mean, what I tried to do throughout writing The Royal Governess was to take people as they seem to be. I read so much. I got as much information as I could about my characters, but then I would sort of, you know, extrapolate on it and put them in certain situations in my mind and you know, see how they went. But I think she was like that, you know. I think she was a very eager to please child, very orderly, very bright, seemed to have an instinctive grasp of you know, formal events and how to behave, and her place in the world as a member of the royal family. Unlike the sister, who was in the most amazing contrast, who was really naughty, Princess Margaret, who was really irreverent, very, very bright as well, but so different. But I think whether Princess Elizabeth had the most kind of huge imagination, I don't know, because I think Margaret did, and maybe Lilibet was, as obviously everybody called her in the family, was much more, you know, it was all about facts. It was more about, you know, it was more about not really questioning things particularly. So I think she was quite happy with and it's, if you were a very orderly child as she was, I think it really suited her to be part of that very formal structure. And it was almost as if she was expecting it, you know, because when it happened and she became the heir to the throne, it didn't seem to faze her very much at all, and she seemed to just step into it and, you know, take it away as she has done ever since. So yeah, I think she really was like that. I mean, Crawford's own account of her is very much this child. And one of the interesting things I found, and which was great to fictionalize, was that she was, because she was so orderly, because Elizabeth liked things to be just so, and had a very you know, orderly mind. She didn't like it when things went beyond her control and became difficult. And so you see in there during the war, she had this, she developed habits which were almost, you could almost say now that they would be sort of OCD. They were obsessive compulsive. So, for example, every night she would put her shoes very, very straight and her laces really straight, as if she, you know, done them with a ruler, and all her clothes very, very neat. And that's obviously, and in the night she would get up and make sure that they were still like that. So it seems as if that's something connected with, you know, a loss of control and not liking, you know, the way things were developing around her that she couldn't do anything about. And in fact, when Crawford first goes to work for them, when she's a smaller girl, she says that Elizabeth had 30 toy horses, and every single night she would groom them and feed them before she could go to bed. So this is a child that really likes things the way she likes them, you know. So that doesn't. So this is a, yeah. So it was easy, given the fact that she was like that, to imagine she was like that in other aspects of her life. And counting out sugar, you know, from the sugar bowl, and lining up pieces of sugar before eating them, whereas Margaret would just put a big handful and then stuff it in her mouth, you know. So yeah, I think she probably was like that.
I have one other question about a dramatic storytelling choice that you made. In the book,
Okay.
Crawford leaving royal service, we have her approach to write a book that, as you say, is unprecedented. And then the book jumps to that wistful final moment. At some point in your research, you had to make a decision not to dramatize the long interval, the unhappy marriage, her time out in the wilderness as an outcast from the royal family. What was that like?
Yes.
Were you ever tempted to take the novel into those years? No,
because I wanted the Royal Governess to be about the glory years. You know, I wanted it to have those arcs of those three, you know, the contrast between the youthful student and the formal institution of Buckingham Palace. And then I wanted the amazing, the abdication, the coronation, the war years, and then the end. But I didn't want to dwell on the unhappy marriage, because, you know, I wanted her to I just thought it would work better actually if that was quicker. And we didn't dwell on it so much, because actually it was really interesting what happened, and it was very confusing, the events surrounding her writing the book. But it's also quite fascinating the way that she was manipulated into doing it, and all the different characters who were involved. I mean, it was real kind of cloak and dagger stuff. So that was interesting. But the 40 years in the wilderness in Aberdeen, I'm not sure that would have made great reading, really.
No,
it would have been sad.
not.
And I wanted, as I say, to have, you know, this is the story about the Queen's childhood, really. And this is the woman who influenced her. And I wanted to show their central relationship. And that was at the heart of the book, really.
And we mentioned that this is becoming a bestseller in the UK.
Yes. Oh, it's so thrilling, Steve. It's number 6 on the bestseller list for the second week. So I'm so delighted.
Have you been approached by readers who remember these events?
No, I haven't actually. But I'm sure, though, well, I suppose they'd have to be fairly, I mean, this happened in 1950. So the people have to be pretty old to remember the end of the story. But no, not yet. But I hope it does stir a few memories in some people. But as I say, these are stories that we all know. You know, that they're so familiar to us. The various historical events, but it's just a different perspective. I mean, one of the things I like to say about it is that the Royal Governess is the prequel to The Crown, because The Crown, the TV program, starts in 1947 when Princess Elizabeth gets married, and this is pretty much the point where the Royal Governess ends, because that's when Elizabeth leaves the palace. But this is the 17 years before that. So yeah, so it's familiar territory for lots of people, I think. Well, so you didn't have to be there.
Well, to wrap up our conversation, I have a natural concluding question. As you mentioned, that Crawford was with the royal family through some of the most seismic events that any royal dynasty in English history encountered. And I'm wondering, to wrap things up, nothing binding, of course, but I'm wondering, do you feel the spell of those events? Are you tempted to return to this period?
Oh, yes. I just think it completely. I mean, I honestly, Steve, I find it really painful to start writing about it because it was so interesting. I mean, people have just had such huge lives then, you know, such enormous things happened and every single person was affected. I just find it amazing. And so I do want to go back to it. But my new subject is actually going to be Wallace Simpson.
Oh, good. I can't wait. Well, I can't thank you enough for joining me. This was wonderful.
Oh, it was absolutely great. Thank you so much for having me, Steve. Anytime.
And the book.
It was great.
Everybody who's listening, it's a terrific evocation of the era and the people.
Thank you. And thank you for your wonderful review. I could not have been more delighted or honoured. It was just so exciting to be in the Washington Post. It's just a dream. So thank you.
Well, good. Very good. Well, when
thank you.
Mrs. Simpson comes around, we'll have to talk again. Well, anyway,
we'll see. We'll see what you think.
And I'll see. I will weigh in, hopefully, in the post. But in the meantime,
brilliant. Thank you.
And we'll be talking soon.
My pleasure.